Thank you very much for visiting my presentation. This is a short paper presentation that I presented at the Independent Learning Association's 2018 conference in Kobe, Japan. I'm Theron Muller. I'm an associate professor at the University of Toyama, and since 2012 I've been working on my PhD at the Open University. So that's why I have the double affiliation up on the screen here. Before I jump into the meat of my presentation, I also wanted to thank the JALT QSIG, who offered me their unvetted presentation spot for this conference, which gave me the opportunity to attend and to present this research. So one of the themes of the Independent Learning Association's conference is student autonomy, and I've been working on my PhD research for 6 years now, and I'm kind of in between. I've submitted my thesis for examination, and my viva's coming up in mid-September, and so I was interested in trying to do something a little bit different with this presentation rather than go into what I've already been working on and writing about for quite a long time. So what I wanted to do was to explore my PhD thesis research, which examines Japan-based language teachers writing for academic publication, from a lens of autonomy, looking at how autonomy can inform what I've been doing in terms of my research, and then also how what I've been doing in terms of my research can hopefully help to inform some of the language teaching autonomy research practices. So, because I'm interested in exploring this theme of autonomy, I wanted to go to the literature and start with a definition of autonomy that's based in SLA. This is from Holick in 1979, so it's a little bit dated, but it's still fairly regularly cited today. And this talks about autonomous language learners. And so what I wanted to do was shift this from the perspective of language learners to authors writing for academic publication. And so that's what I've done in this slide here. And I've also tried to change the language so it's not gender specific throughout. In doing this, there were some pretty straightforward changes: autonomous learner to autonomous author, and there were two places that are bolded and underlined it, the contents and the investigation, where deciding what to put in was a little bit more tricky, which is why I've included the underline there. So from ideas to correct contents and then methods of investigation, I think as a placeholder it's good enough for now to kind of get into the meat of the research in a little bit more depth and detail. So this is paragraph form, which is not very conducive to a presentation format. So I've broken it out into bullets here, and then that's still an awful lot of text, so I tried to take out some of the superfluous text, things that I just don't have time to talk about, and then trying to make the descriptions a little bit more compact there. And specifically, what I'm going to be getting into in detail in terms of the data for my PhD research are authors taking responsibility for the totality of their writing, authors determining individual contents, authors defining contents to be written and progression of the writing, along with that objective specific to the author, and then the authors evaluating progress, and finally that kind of the redefinition of knowledge. I want to interrogate that toward the end of the presentation. So before I get into the data, I think it's important to cover my research methodology. I describe my methodology as ethnographically informed, which means taking time to do research, looking for insider perspectives, and then trying to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. Having lived in Japan for 18 years, one of the big challenges here was trying to put a little bit of distance between me and some of the practices of Japanese higher education so that I could approach them as an outsider as opposed to as an insider. On top of that ethnographically informed methodology, more specifically, I've channeled New Literacies research, which considers literacy a social practice and seeks to investigate, seeks to research literacy as a social practice. And then also critical discourse analysis, which looks to question issues of power in discourse and try to look at how the language used in texts perpetuates imbalances in power. So the overall project included 23 Japan-based authors working in the broad field of language teaching in higher education, 9 Japanese authors, 14 foreign residents of Japan. From that, in the thesis itself, I created profiles for 7 core authors, and I investigated 6 text histories that those 7 core authors wrote. One of the text histories I did was co-authored by 2 of my author participants. That's why there's that discrepancy, 7 and 6. And I also did a critical discourse analysis of the correspondence surrounding the author's published manuscripts. I would love to get into all of the details of the data I include in my 400 pages of PhD. Unfortunately, in a 20-minute presentation, it's just not possible to cover everything. So rather than try to take like a spreadshot approach, I decided to choose one group of authors and one manuscript to focus on. Specifically, the pseudonyms for the authors are Jason and Alan, both foreign residents of Japan. They hold full-time term contracts. Each of them has 10 or more experiences of writing for publication in Japan for Japan-based publications. And the text history of theirs that I analyzed was an outside Japan indexed journal paper. Indexed here means that it's included in one of the indexes of international indexes of journals, which means that it's generally considered quite a prestigious journal. And Jason and Alan wrote this as co-authors. It was the first time for both of them to write a paper and publish in an indexed journal outside of Japan. So I mentioned that I wanted to get into the bullet regarding authors taking responsibility for the totality of their writing, and this graphic is the graphical representation of the text history of Jason and Alan's one manuscript on its way to publication. And I think one thing I should note here is that I had 7 versions of the manuscript to analyze, so that's what I analyzed in my research. But the reality is that any of these graphical representations are inevitably less complex than the actual manuscript was, because there are almost certainly versions of the manuscript that they worked on between each other that I didn't have immediate access to, that I couldn't analyze. These versions were versions that were sent to different brokers for feedback. And the term broker means people who look at and analyze, evaluate a text. And it can include editors and reviewers, and it can also include what are referred to as unofficial brokers. For this particular text, versions 1 and 2 were sent to a friend of Jason's who was a reviewer for their target journal, or had reviewed for their target journal, and gave them feedback. And then version 3 is the version sent to the journal for review. And then it follows through a second round of review, and then after that, another decision on the paper, and then finally copy editing. I think the point that I want to make here is that that statement, authors take responsibility for the totality of their writing, when you approach the data and you look at the data in the way that I've laid it out here, you can see that that's not 100% true for this paper, and it wasn't true for all of the papers from my PhD thesis research. All of the manuscripts didn't have just the authors taking responsibility for the writing, but they had a number of different brokers working on their manuscripts throughout the process. So in my thesis, I created 6 different text trajectories that all look basically like this here. The next point I wanted to talk about was the authors determining the individual objectives of their writing. And here I wanted to focus on the version 4 review of their manuscript, where you had version 3 recordings were analyzed to roughly gauge progress over the course of the academic year. The review comment comes back and says roughly gauge progress, why not use test results? And so in version 4, in response to this reviewer's comment, they add a data table where they do measure 4 aspects of their students' language production. So they had recordings of their students from the end of the semester, and so in this version of their manuscript they do an analysis of those recordings, and then they create a table, a data table, evidencing some of the claims that they had made in their version 3 manuscript, and then they use that table to further reinforce the claims that are made regarding student progress on their course. And again, the point that I want to make here is that the objective of evidencing the student's progress comes through the reviewer's comment saying you need to evidence the student's progress, as opposed to it being a kind of independent decision by the authors to do the work of analyzing the student's speeches in order to evidence the claims that they're making. So, coming back to the concept of authors taking responsibility for the totality of their writing, that specific example that I gave you was just one specific example from this overall total trajectory, and I could have chosen a number of other examples from this trajectory or from any of the trajectories of the text that I selected. So what I want to try to convey to you is that that's just the very, very tip of the iceberg, rather than showing you everything that ended up being changed. I just gave you one specific example of something that was changed in the manuscript's trajectory. I think I've got time to go into one more specific example, and then I would like to try to broaden out the presentation and think about some implications. So this other specific example determines this statement: defines contents to be written and progression of writing. And in the review of version 3 of the manuscript, you have comments about serious issues with the methodology, and then the editor mentioning that they should foreground action research and noting that the reviewer's critique of the methodology is valid. And so the authors, in response to this, choose to frame the paper as an action research as opposed to centering the paper around 3 types of data collection. They refer to 3 iterative cycles of action research to organize the paper. And in doing that, in the version 4 of the manuscript, they include a sentence that paraphrases action research. And you can see the sentence there: an inheritively iterative process where a round of research is reflected upon and often followed by additional rounds of inquiry. And you've got the reviewer critiques their representation, their paraphrase of action research, saying actually it is the cycles of curriculum action or pedagogical practice which are primary in action research, with the cycles of research making sense of these. So your paraphrase of action research is incorrect. And so the author's response was to delete the paraphrasing sentence, and they lead with a direct quotation from the literature of action research. So we're not going to try to define it. We'll go the safe route, and we'll take somebody else's definition and stick it into the paper. And so once again, you have that heading: defines content to be written in progression of writing. And what's happening when you look at the data is that the authors are trying to define the content to be written and are trying to set the progression of the writing, but you have the reviewers are inserting their opinions about what should be written and are also determining how the writing progresses. So in this case, this is a change that they have to make in order for their paper to be accepted to the journal. So I want to come back here to this definition of autonomy that I kind of developed in writing for academic publication, and I want to think about how, in light of the data that I've shared from my own research, these definitions could be changed to better reflect the author's experiences as I've described them in my presentation, and then also as my larger data set indicates. And so that's what I've tried to do here in blue. Authors manage responsibility for writing in negotiation with brokers, and I defined brokers earlier. It could be editors and reviewers. And then again, objectives are determined in negotiation with brokers, and contents to be written in progression are negotiated with brokers. Objectives specific to the manuscript determine what is included. Writing proceeds from ideas to contents, and those are negotiated with brokers. Contents based on objective set and applicability to internal and external constraints, which include constraints imposed by brokers. Brokers and authors evaluate progress in anticipation of and response to broker evaluations. And redefinition of knowledge to subjective, shared knowledge negotiated in interactions between authors and brokers, as opposed to individual author knowledge. So the authors aren't the ones who hold the knowledge, but rather the knowledge exists in the interaction between authors and brokers. And I think before I move to the next slide, I just want to mention that objectives specific to the manuscript, I had a real debate with myself about what word to put in there, but in my research I specifically investigated authors writing for publication, so I really focused down on the papers they were publishing, and I didn't look at kind of broader questions like what is research, because I did have some authors push back at me and say what I did wasn't research, what I did was kind of a classroom investigation. And so I tried to avoid those kind of bigger questions, but I do agree, I do think that those bigger questions deserve to be investigated in more depth. I just haven't done them in this particular, investigation. So what are some potential implications for autonomy in SLA? Well, if you're thinking about trying to foster an autonomous writer, somebody who's going to be doing high-level professional production such as academic writing for publication, then I think the concept of the social construction of knowledge needs to come into their preparations for writing for publication. And then the processes of this social construction and the strategies for navigating it involve more than individually defined objectives and constraints. They're interacting with other people who also impose objectives and constraints on what they're writing, what they're doing, their knowledge production. And then the writing product is shaped through interaction and negotiation rather than individually determined. So I think in trying to prepare people to be autonomous authors, autonomous writers for publication, there also needs to be some preparation for them to be ready to do that interaction and negotiation with the brokers that they're inevitably going to have to deal with, and the goalposts they're inevitably going to have to cross, goalposts that are often defined by the brokers they interact with. And then I wanted to bring it back to my research before I finish the presentation and talk about some specific implications for language teachers writing for publication. One of them was that across the manuscripts I analyzed, the discussion, the actual text of the manuscript, was shifted away from a kind of teaching, a pedagogy focus, toward a more research focus in the manuscript's trajectories. You saw that to a certain extent with how the Jason and Alan's text was changed from talking about roughly gauging progress to actually quantifying those changes by analyzing discrete variables and presenting them in a table. And then that shift away from the teaching focus toward a research focus, I think, may speak to the gap that's commonly referred to between teaching and then research into second language acquisition, because all of the people that were included in, all of the authors who participated in my research were language teachers, and most of them were trying to write language-focused papers, but as their papers went through the process of review and evaluation, it was those reviews and evaluations that shifted their papers away from a focus on the classroom and language teaching, more toward a focus on research and evaluation of variables and setting up a kind of experimental format. And so because that's kind of systemic in their experience of writing for publication, that could help to perpetuate and to perhaps widen this gap, because teachers who are particularly focused on the classroom, when they seek to publish, feel like their published papers are being moved away from the classroom, which may discourage them from continuing to try to write for publication, because what they end up writing for publication doesn't necessarily fit their reasoning or their thinking behind why it's important for them to be writing for publication from a kind of professional development perspective. And finally, these are the references from my presentation and my emails there on the screen. I will be uploading this presentation to my website, so you can always see the slides there, and then this is a video, so you're welcome to pause it and review at any time. Thank you very much.